Good morning, everyone. I'm going to cover STI and BBV trends before handing over to Byron, who will cover HIV. So all of this data is for the current reporting period, which ended in the fourth quarter of 2016. So first of all, the infections that we receive a large number of notifications for. So chlamydia notifications have remained quite comparable over time. With unspecified hepatitis B and unspecified hepatitis C, we've seen small increases over time. We've seen large increases is in gonorrhoea notifications. This slide looks at infections that we receive a smaller number of notifications for. So with newly acquired hepatitis B, the notifications have remained fairly comparable over time. With newly acquired hepatitis C, we've seen small decreases in comparison to the historical average and the previous 12-month period, and we've seen really large increases in infectious syphilis. So looking at these in more detail. So if we look at gonorrhoea notifications by exposure category, we can see that the increases mostly occurred in the metropolitan area amongst those with a heterosexual exposure, particularly amongst females. So amongst metropolitan females, the increase is about 77% higher than the previous 12-month period and 3 times higher than the historical average. 91% of metro females had no history of a previous gonorrhea infection in the prior 5-year period. There's no increase in reported sex work, that's remained stable at about 3%. And about 82% received the correct treatment for their infection, and that's remained stable since 2014. Look at gonorrhea testing data. Amongst metropolitan females, the testing rate has remained fairly stable, but the test positivity rate increased by 67% and the notification rate increased by 73%. So the increase is most likely to be being driven by increased disease transmission. And infectious syphilis, by exposure category, you can see it's all about metro MSM. The notifications were more than double the previous 12-month period, more than 3 times the historical average. About 93% had no history of a previous infectious syphilis notification in the prior 5-year period, so it's not likely that the increase is being driven by a cohort getting a lot of reinfections. In recent years, we've seen an increase in the proportion of infectious syphilis notifications amongst metro MSM who were detected during the early latent stage, and they have mostly been picked up through routine sexual health screening. And if we look at syphilis testing notification data in the metropolitan area, now this is for combined infectious syphilis and non-infectious syphilis, and this looks at all men, not just MSM, but this gives us some idea of what might be happening. So the testing rate amongst males in the metropolitan area has remained very stable, but we've seen massive increases in the notification rate and the test positivity rate. So again, the increase is likely to be being driven by increased disease transmission. Okay, are there any questions before I hand over to Byron? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. So, HIV notifications. So we'll start off by looking at total number of cases reported since 2011. And between 2011 and 2014, we did see an increase in HIV notifications in WA. This number peaked in 2014 at just under 140 cases for that year, and that was the highest number we'd seen on record in WA. But in the last 2 years since then, we saw a 19% decrease in the number of cases, with 113 reported last year, and that was the lowest number of cases we'd seen since 2011. If we look at the rates among males and females, males continue to have a high rate of notification compared to females. The male rate notably increased in 2012 before peaking at just over 8 cases per 100,000 men in 2014. In the last 2 years, we did see a 10% decrease in male HIV notification rates, down to 7.5 cases per 100,000 last year. We saw a more notable decrease among females, where the rate decreased from around 2.5 cases per 100,000 to just over 1 case per 100,000 last year. If we look at notifications by exposure category, we start by looking at trends in men who have sex with men. Last year, there were 71 cases notified in MSM, which was stable compared to the previous 12 months, but still 18% higher compared to the previous 5-year average. So you can see with that green line there, over time we did see an increase in MSM HIV notifications, but in the last 2 years we've seen that number stabilise in WA. As for male heterosexual cases, there were 21 cases notified last year, which was a 30% decrease compared to the previous year as well as the previous 5-year average. And similarly with heterosexual female cases, we had 14 cases notified last year, and that was a decrease compared to previous data. So you can see with the red and blue lines there, over time we have seen a gradual decrease in heterosexually acquired HIV in Western Australia. So the next slide I'll go into some of the trends behind that decrease in more detail. So if you look at heterosexually acquired HIV by place of birth and acquisition, if we start by looking at heterosexual male cases, you can see in the last 5 years, particularly since 2012, you can see with that black dotted line, the overall number of heterosexually acquired male cases has declined in Western Australia. And then if we break that down by place of birth and acquisition, you can see with that blue line, most of that decrease can be attributed to a decline in numbers in overseas-born men who acquired HIV overseas, and these are mainly men from high prevalence regions. To a lesser extent, we did see a spike in the number of Australian-born men acquiring HIV overseas through heterosexual transmission in 2012, but since then that number has declined and stabilised at around 7 to 8 cases in the last 3 years. If we look at the same trends for females, in the same time period, we saw again an overall decrease in heterosexual female notifications. Despite that spike in 2014, overall the notification trend has been downwards. And again, most of that decrease can be attributed to a decline in women from high prevalence regions who acquired HIV in those regions prior to coming to WA. So in total, in 2016, there were 35 heterosexually acquired notifications in WA, and that's the lowest number we've seen since 2005. So just to finish off, I'll go through the HIV testing trends in Western Australia, and we'll start by looking at the male HIV testing trends represented by that red graph on the left there. And you might remember from the last forum I explained that the male testing rate has fluctuated because of the introduction of HIV screening at the Christmas Island Immigration Detention Centre. But in recent years that has stabilised, and we've seen testing rates among males remain very stable in the last 2 to 3 years. In that same time, though, the HIV notification rate in males has decreased, as I reported before, and corresponding with that, the positivity rate for males has decreased in the last 2 years. So it suggests to us that the recent decrease in HIV notifications in men wasn't necessarily due to a decrease in testing, but it suggests we may be seeing an actual decrease in disease incidence among males in WA. Nevertheless, the positivity and notification rates are still notably higher than what we saw back in 2011. So just to finish off, the same trends for females. The testing rate for females has declined in the last 5 years, but that's stabilised in the last 2 years. Over the same period of time, we've seen the notification rates among females decrease, like I reported earlier, and corresponding with that, a decrease in positivity among females. So again, the recent decrease in female cases suggests a possible decrease in actual disease incidence in WA, given that the testing rate has remained stable in the last 2 years, but notification and positivity rates have declined.